Have you ever been in an online debate where somebody claims that the homebrew you've built for a fantasy role-playing game isn't realistic? In a game where there's dragons and magic and people come back from the dead, well, what are people meaning when they say that it isn't realistic? Hi, I'm Peter, creator and lead designer of Tales from Elsewhere, and in this week's video, we're going to be examining realism, verisimilitude, and immersion, and what these three terms really mean and how I think they're used and misused by the community. Now, before we hop in, I'll remind everybody that every week on this YouTube channel, we release a new video digging into game design philosophy in its various forms, as well as a dev blog of the tabletop role-playing game that I'm building called Tales from Elsewhere. The first setting book, Clockworld, is running its Kickstarter right now, so we'll put a link to that page. It'd mean the world if you could go and sign up to be notified when it goes live, or like, subscribe this video, share it with your friends, the whole deal. All right, enough of those pleasantries. Let's hop into today's discussion. So the first order of business is to talk through some definitions, some uses of these three terms, and figure out what they mean and maybe drill down into how they can be applicable in game design. So we've got immersion, verisimilitude, and realism. And I didn't present these in a Venn diagram because they're not necessarily different terms that all overlap. They're parts of the same process, and I'll unpack what I mean by that. The goal of all of this discussion is really immersion. Immersion is when the players feel engrossed in a story, or they're part of the world. They feel connected to the game they're playing in a substantive way. They're part of an experience that they wouldn't have in the real world necessarily. They're immersed in the game. And I'd say that every tabletop role-playing game has this as a goal in some form or another. Even something that's really crunchy or wargamey like, say, Lancer, is still trying to immerse you in a mech space opera game, and is trying to simulate those kinds of experiences with its gameplay design. So immersion isn't unique to just narrative-focused games or rules-light games. All tabletop role-playing games really have this as an underlying goal in some manner, regardless of whether you are a Powered by the Apocalypse game like Brindlewood Bay, trying to immerse you in the cozy New England scene where you're going to solve some crimes as little old ladies, or if you're playing a very crunchy D&D 4th edition, war simulator. All of that has a goal of immersion, and the other terms here can help feed into that. Now, verisimilitude is kind of a $10 word, but it has to do with the appearance of truth, the appearance of, quotes, realism, but not realism as it relates to the real world. Instead, verisimilitude has to do with consistency. Mechanical consistency, where things interact with each other in a way that is consistent. For example, if your world has really complex magic rules for, how the cosmos is organized and how the gods interact, if that's inconsistent, it can break verisimilitude. If some aspect of it is only applicable in some cases and some are not, that's breaking verisimilitude. Similarly, if there's tonal consistency, that helps keep verisimilitude in place. This is where the world that is imagined before you is consistent unto itself in the rules it establishes. And you'll see this a lot in movies and TV shows where a lack of consistency with established canon, established mechanics, can break you out of your immersion because the world is not tonally or mechanically consistent. A great example of this is in the sequel trilogy of Star Wars films that came out some years ago. The way that hyperspace worked in some of those movies was not consistent with how hyperspace worked in the prequel trilogy or original trilogy, and that broke verisimilitude for some super nerdy viewers like myself when Poe Dameron does light skipping with his hyperdrive. That broke verisimilitude for me because of the established canon of how these systems worked. Similarly, when a show or a movie, like one of the Star Wars sequel trilogies, has humor that's out of place, that can also have a tonal inconsistency which breaks verisimilitude. This is something that drives me nuts in movies all the time. I can buy into any fantasy you give me as long as it's consistent. So when we're building games, we have to make sure that we're being consistent within the game itself. Next, we have realism. Now, realism is, I think, misused sometimes to mean verisimilitude, like they mean verisimilitude when they say realism. But the way I see realism is the depth of details and its real-world analogs. And what I mean by that is a game or movie or show can be realistic when it templates back onto the real world in a consistent way, when it is drawing from our world and the physics that govern it in some manner. For example, a show like The Expanse is a science fiction show that is attempting to have an amount of realism even though it's doing space battles. And they attempt this by applying a lot of our real-world physics to their imagined space battles, having to do with the decompression of a spaceship so that you don't explosively decompress if you get hit by flak, to having emergency kits in every room on a battleship in space that you could use to plug holes that would go into the void of space. All sorts of little things like that, how the ships move and act. That is a real-world analog applied to their fictitious world. So if you're making a game that's goal is realism, it means that you're going to be taking real-world mechanics, if you will, and applying them to your game. And now to superemphasize the difference between verisimilitude and realism, remember that realism is about the real world. Verisimilitude is about the consistency of a fictitious world. So if people are saying that something is unrealistic, what they may be referring to is that it doesn't cohere with the established mechanical or tonal aspect of an imagined space. So that's one of the places I see the most confusion of term use, because in some cases they mean verisimilitude, and in other cases they mean realism, but they may not be using those terms with precision. Now, I am not the arbiter of all things game design, nor do I control its language, but I feel like my definitions here are a useful grounding point for discussion. We could get into the comments and maybe talk about the details and nuance of my term use here, but if you work with me on these terms, I think you'll see that they're fairly effective when it comes to placing these mechanics that I've listed down below and discussing them in their realism, verisimilitude, and immersive value. And now let's talk through some of these systems, because remember, every system, whether it be a system attempting realism or verisimilitude, is attempting to increase immersion. Really, at the end of the day, you're trying to simulate in some manner an experience to draw the players into your game and have them have fun. So let's take a look at a couple of these. These are game terms or subsystems that I see debated frequently on Reddit or in YouTube comments and so forth. So let's talk through some of them. First one let's talk about is encumbrance rules. This one is, if we were to adhere to the highly flawed GNS theory, highly in the simulationist side of things. Detailed rules about how much you can weigh, how much you can carry, or how much you can put in bags. D&D is notorious for having a fairly detailed encumbrance system that everybody ignores. Encumbrance can really help with realism, right? People can't carry that much stuff. You can't carry thousands and thousands of gold pieces without being weighed down by it. Armor is heavy, and it matters how much you're carrying. You can't swim across a river when you're encumbered by armor, right? So all of that is an attempt to create realism. But encumbrance also can tax the game itself. It's often seen as a little too nuanced or gritty or detailed or onerous to be included. I'm of the opinion that an amount of encumbrance rules, though, does have a sense of realism to it that I like when you're trying to ground the game in realism. Encumbrance doesn't necessarily help verisimilitude per se, because in your heroic game, it may not matter how much you're carrying because that's not the focus of the gameplay. But encumbrance certainly adds to the realism aspect of a game. Similarly, attempting to simulate aspects of HEMA, or historical European martial arts, into a role-playing game, adding that very detailed back and forth parry and riposte, this sort of structure is seen as realism. But very, very few role-playing games actually attempt this level of realism, because the taxation, the burden that it puts on the system is often very high, where attempting to slow down and zoom in on that system of the intricacies of sword play and exposing an enemy to one solid strike can burden the game significantly. But it is highly immersive when it comes to realism. But we have to always gauge at what cost. In that same aspect are survival systems, where thirst and hunger, dying of exposure, of being too cold or too hot, these are all realism enhancers because our world is bound by such limitations. But like HEMA structures and encumbrance, you're adding a level of realism not in a vacuum, but as part of a greater system. And that can really immerse somebody in your world. I'm one of the crazy folks out there who actually finds it interesting to track rations and food and water, and to have overland travel be somewhat dangerous in that regard, but I know that's not shared by a whole lot of people. And it's why in my game, the encumbrance and survival systems are very light touches, but they're not absent. So my encumbrance system isn't one meant to be ignored, but it's not as detailed as, say, tracking every pound of gold that you carry. Similarly, the survival systems are lighter touches, where you don't need to track your provisions like in detail, like, oh, I only have 3 days of food left. Instead, provisions just help you recover when you're traveling. They're more of a consumable that is useful to have, but isn't required per se to adventure, though there is an optional rule in the book to make it required every day to have some amount of provisions. Jumping over a little bit, let's talk about humor in a role-playing game. Whether that be humorous rules, humorous language, or humorous gameplay, people making jokes. This is something I've seen a lot of folks say breaks their immersion when they're playing, say, a gritty game or a horror game, is when people make jokes, or when things are funny. And I totally understand that. It's like you've maybe seen in a Marvel movie these days where a heavy moment is undermined by a little bit too much humor being added in. And that breaks your verisimilitude. It's not unrealistic because people respond to horror and tragedy in all sorts of different ways, and one of those coping mechanisms is humor. But when the established feeling and vibe of the scene or game is not humorous, then it can take you out of that immersion that you've been working on. The reverse is true. If you're playing what is ostensibly a humorous game, like Peasantry as an example, then something that's really grimdark or too serious will also take you out of that immersive experience. It's pulling you out of this whimsical or silly game and putting you into a different headspace, and that works against the internal consistency of the game. Now, let's talk about hit points and wounds. If you've watched this YouTube channel for any amount of time or hung out in the TFE Discord server, you know that I am the wounds guy. I am championing against hit points across the world. But in all honesty, hit points and wounds are just different systems with different applications. But hit points are a highly game sort of approach, right? It's an abstraction to the extreme. And hit points can work against verisimilitude and realism, because hit points abstract away things that don't seem realistic. I'll give you an example. I'm playing some D&D 2024. I still play quite regularly. I don't run D&D as much these days. I still have fun playing it. And the party ranger, who's about level 7, falls off a 60-foot drop fighting some gargoyles up on some cliffs, and they pick him up and throw him off, and he plummets 60 feet and lands with a thud. Rolls some damage. He's fine. He stands back up and keeps shooting his bow, like basically nothing happened. That's not very realistic, honestly, and in that moment, my verisimilitude, it didn't feel right to me. That being clawed and hurt was more substantive, and falling that distance seemed so jarring when they just stood up afterward that my immersion was broken to a degree. Now I'm used to this in D&D, and I've been ranting about fall damage for like 4 editions now, but the hit points abstraction of how it's not really meat points and it's not really how healthy you are, it's more like an abstraction of your heroism to some degree. In that moment, I thought, well, what the heck does hit points even mean if I can survive such a high fall? Like, the damage die were nearly maxed out, right, on that he could take from such a huge fall. So it worked against, I thought, the consistency of the world. Wounds are attempting to add some amount of realism to the game, and depending on the wound system, it'll add different levels of amounts, right? This is where, getting shot by a gun will be really bad and make you start bleeding to death, or a monster biting your leg will disable that leg until it's repaired or bandaged or triaged. And so that's adding an amount of realism, because in the real world, getting hurt is bad, right? In the real world, our bodies are very vulnerable. Doesn't matter how heroic you are. Doesn't matter how cool you are or well trained, getting torn apart by monsters would kill you very quickly. But like so many of these systems, wound systems are adding in a level of mechanical burden and nuance to the game that may not work well for you. And these two, hit points and wounds, are really different approaches. And one should always wonder how much you're willing to sacrifice that immersion with hit points, and how you want to maybe work around that in your game. And there's many solutions to doing so, including hybrid systems where you have HP and then you potentially take wounds when the HP goes down, or you keep the hit point totals extremely low so that death is always around the corner, like in a lot of OSR games. But they serve different purposes, and they can lean in more or less to an immersive experience. Now, related to hit points and wounds, but not necessarily connected directly to it, is the subject of recovery. How hard it is to get back in the action after being hurt in some way. And this applies whether you're using hit points or wounds or any other system. It's when the player's characters are degraded in some way, harmed, how do you go about recovering from that? And in some games, like say D&D 5th edition, recovery is highly abstracted. In a short rest, you spend hit die, whatever hit die are, and regain some HP. And when you take a long rest, sleep one night, you are completely recovered basically of everything. Which isn't very realistic, but again, D&D 5th edition isn't, or 2024, 5.5, is not aiming for realism. And overall, the fiction of such a high fantasy world is meant to be like superheroes at times, right? You aren't bogged down by these wounds or anything like that. You jump back into the action quickly. And so as long as that stays moderately consistent within that fantasy world, it can still remain highly immersive. But recovery is another way that you can have more realism in a game. If you've ever seen the movie The Duelists, there's an example of somebody dueling with rapiers, and they get stabbed once in the shoulder, but a piece of their linen shirt gets punctured into the wound and causes the wound to get infected, and dude is down for like a month recovering from this. He gets a fever, nearly dies from one little stab. Or, my boy Bobby B in Game of Thrones, or The Song of Ice and Fire, right? Simply getting gored once by a single boar, and the resulting internal bleeding and injury is enough to kill a king, a war hero and a king. So realism can be how easy it is to recover and how long it takes to recover from those injuries. You have games like Modiphius 2D20, Achtung Cthulhu, where your injuries require downtime and rolls to even to have a chance of removing, and can leave permanent scars. And that can take a significant amount of downtime to end up clearing. If you use the gritty recovery rules in D&D 5th edition and 5.5, it has examples of turning your short rests into 8 hours a night's sleep and your long rests requiring a week. All of that is attempting to add that level of gritty realism in the hopes of making a more immersive experience. But again, these immersive processes are highly subjective because each fantasy world at your table has a different level of verisimilitude, a different consistency that they're aiming for. And now these last two terms are something that comes up in the kind of games I work on a lot because I'm doing like a Weird West game, so they tend to have firearms and distance measuring. And these two I'm going to put somewhat together. So realism of exact distance measuring is, realistic if, the exact distances between things are measured with precision. But oftentimes it creates so much burden on a system to be very detailed about how tall characters are, or how long their limbs are, or how far a weapon can fire. You have something like D&D 5th edition, which simply has a close range and a long range for any given weapon. Whether that's, 30 feet for close range, then 120 feet for long, they have it as 2 increments. That is more detailed than simply having one maximum range that the weapon can fire at, right? If you just say, this weapon can hit anything within 100 feet, then that's simpler and less realistic, because if you've ever attempted to fire a firearm or use a bow or anything like that, you'll know just how much darn harder it is to hit things as they get farther away. So how your distance measuring and difficulties are calculated is a significant point of realism, but my experience has been that those exact details of distance often aren't worth the squeeze, as they say. The juice isn't worth the squeeze. It can add so much nuance that's unnecessary to a scene, so I always caution people about how they approach exact distance measuring and whether or not it's going to matter. Similarly, with firearms, you'll have a lot of people talking about firearms as a source of realism. And let me tell you, everybody has a fantasy firearm in almost every game they have. They're going to obfuscate or ignore some aspect of firearm simulation, because if you've never shot a gun before, if you imagine how loud you think the gun is when it's fired, it's way louder than that. Guarantee it, whatever you're thinking the loudness is, it's louder. That's because it's not something that any of the fantasy or movies, TV shows, or games really bother to show, because it's not fun. If you ever see a film in which the characters are exchanging gunfire inside of a closed room, everybody in that room would be deaf temporarily. They'd all have tinnitus at that point. It would be very bad. Guns are incredibly loud. But that level of realism is not enjoyable, and honestly would break people's immersion more often than in that it would pull them out, because now they're having to get all this detail. And it's why almost no games really bother with the loudness of the gun in a substantive way, in a deafening way, because it's honestly unenjoyable. But that would be realistic. With firearms, you'll also have games that will have varying levels of ammo tracking and reload mechanics, and there's a huge spectrum here of what is realistic for firearms. And there's not a right or wrong answer to that, but what I would posit to you, if you're having firearms in your game, is to ask yourself, what's the most enjoyable part of having the firearm in your game? What's the most interesting aspect of that weapon? And to try to obfuscate or abstract away the less interesting or evocative parts of that subsystem. And so I've got all these terms in these columns, not because they're part of categories per se, but how I think what a lot of subsystems that get added to games are attempting to do is add realism to them, not necessarily verisimilitude. And I think in the end, it's verisimilitude that's the most important part of the realism versus verisimilitude equation, because it's verisimilitude that increases immersion. Realism isn't what necessarily will immerse somebody in a game if they're buying into the established fantasy. It's the consistency of the presented world, this presented system, that's going to keep people engaged. People find Star Trek, incredibly immersive, even if it's very unrealistic at times, because they magic away a lot of stuff with like warp fields and you know, there's little medical stims and phasers and their transporters, right? None of that's realistic, but I personally get highly immersed in Star Trek storylines. The same thing can be said in games. Even if a game is highly unrealistic, if the world presented to you is consistent, then you can remain engaged with that game world. Well, I hope you found that interesting. The goal with this video was to think through with you, the viewer, how these terms are used and maybe how we can better understand them and discuss them with each other. And like I said in last week's video, I'm experimenting with different formats of these lectures, and in this case a more presentation lecture style. And let me know in the comments if you found this more effective at communicating these ideas, because the goal with this YouTube channel, apart from the dev blog aspect, is to act as an educational tool, a nice library of topics for you, the viewer, to help work through your tabletop role-playing game journey. And as always, I want to thank you for watching this. It means a lot that people take the time out of their day to check out my ramblings here on YouTube. If you'd like to help support these efforts and the creatives that go behind it, consider checking out the Patreon page. We release an additional video every week to patrons where I discuss additional topics, talk about game design, or just share my random thoughts about movies. You can also join the Tales from Elsewhere Discord server. I'm highly active in there. We're always hanging out and helping test each other's games and really working together to improve our design chops. Lastly, of course, I'll plug again the Tales from Elsewhere Clockworld Kickstarter, which there will be a link down below. Consider checking that out. We're going to be finalizing the game and sending it out to people, and I can't wait to make that game a reality. All right, folks, hope to see you here next week on Tales from Elsewhere.